I spent a couple of years working with special needs kids at Manhattan High School. I was a paraprofessional educator, and I grew to love these people quite a bit. Some of the sweetest people I've known, just so appreciative and fun. There was one who was a little scary, who had to be restrained, but for the most part, these were just some of the brightest spirits I've worked with. And I began to notice that the system is in place as if these people are lesser than, as if these are a less deserving people, a less worthy people, a less useful people than the rest of us. And I started to wonder, what if we flipped that around? What if someone who has Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, on the autism spectrum, what if we treated them different because they vibrate on a higher plane than we do? I was never able to really envision how that would work. I don't think it's such a good idea for all of them to be revered or worshipped or treated like they're kings and queens. I don't think that would serve Rachel in particular. She was already royalty as far as she was concerned. We used to walk through the hallways and pretend that we were king and queen and everyone else were the peasants. But what would that look like? What if we took the paradigm that God doesn't make a mistake? God wouldn't give us someone with cerebral palsy as a mistake. That is, someone is different. There is probably a greater reason. We do the same thing with people who are gay or trans. The system, for the most part, is in place as if these are lesser people. These are abnormal folks, rather than approaching it like, well, if someone is different, maybe they have deeper insight than the heteronormative. And I believe that there are some cultures that do this, particularly indigenous cultures of the North American continent and maybe elsewhere, where people who are gay, people who are trans, or people who identify in a non-normative gender are holy people. I quote an article about gender variance in indigenous cultures. The article is entitled Returning to Ourselves, Two-Spirit Futures, and the Now. Indigenous LGBTQ and two-spirit peoples gifted their communities with powerful expressions of relationship making, creating knowledge on how to form ties using the body, spirit, and other parts of life. So basically, the Great Spirit doesn't make a mistake. If someone is different, then there is a reason behind it. And this different person, this two-spirit person, fills a void in our world. Could we have a world like this, where someone who is different is revered as a healer or someone with deeper insight into all of us? I can't claim to be two-spirit. That would be a whole other culture. And I want to share that when I first heard the term, I liked it. I liked it because growing up as a gay guy, particularly, or even before I came out of the closet, I could spend time in conversation with a group full of young women and feel like I am one of the girls. And I could also talk with a group of young men and feel like I'm one of the boys. I got insight into two worlds. That's why I became endeared to the term two-spirit. And I began to notice that women talk about men very differently than men talk about women. An example. a friend of mine, Trisha, was really into this young man, Bart. And Trisha knew I had spent some time at Bart's house with some other young men, men in the company of men. This was college, early 80s. And Trisha asked me, did he say anything about his feelings for me? I considered answering truthfully, which would have been, Trisha, he was lighting his farts. That would have been honest. Women somehow thought that men talk about relationships and feelings, and that's not what men talked about. I've reflected on what needs to be in place for us to live in a world that is free of rape culture. And I believe that locker room talk needs to be addressed. And I've wondered about someone who identifies as a man who may have been assigned female at birth. If that person were allowed to use a men's locker room, which he should be, that this might bring a certain diversity to the locker room that might alter locker room talk in a positive way. People who support President Trump excuse his talk about grabbing women by the pussy by saying that's just locker room talk, and I don't believe there's such a thing as just locker room talk. And if more gender diversity were allowed in a locker room, there could be a tempering of locker room talk that happens. And I also wonder about making this talk more public. What if we took it upon ourselves to make it known? Someone said this man said this, or this woman said this. If it's about violence, if it's joking about harming someone or sexually assaulting someone, that's what people mean when they say locker room talk. I'm not sure locker room talk is such a good thing. Accepting and honoring people who are trans and people who identify in a non-normative gender matters. And it is an important change to make in our world that will make things better for more than just the trans person. Could we live in a world where locker room talk becomes public, or is that a violation of privacy? I wonder why locker rooms are gender exclusive even. If men and women shared locker rooms, we wouldn't have a need for a phrase locker room talk that glorifies violence. In Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies class, we read about trans sex workers. One of the most wonderful things you can do for yourself is hire a sex worker. And I can see why someone who's trans would be drawn to that work, because a good sex worker is a kind of healer. And someone who identifies in a non-normative gender way has a deeper insight into the human experience than the gender normative. And they're able to bring healing into the erotic space and at the same time fulfill erotic need. And when I look at the world through a more intolerant lens in terms of sins of the flesh are wrong, I can see why prostitution is illegal, because it allows for exponential increase of physical pleasure. The full-bodied erotic experiences you can have by working with someone who understands the human spirit and the human body allows for transformative experiences, physical, and spiritual, and emotional. Safety is another reason that it's an advantage at times to work with a sex worker, because you can have amazing experiences that are very safe in terms of transmission of STDs. And I wonder, could this even exist in our world? Could the purchase of erotic experience be normalized and legalized? Sometimes I've been on a road trip. At an exit, I'll see something like a porn palace. And it makes me think of someone who's on a road trip, lonely, might want to stop and experience physical pleasure. And I wondered about, what if these were legal brothels? And that might not be the quite word, but a place where somebody could acceptably get those needs met. And to revere the experience, we might establish them as spiritual centers, temples. And the sex workers as holy people,